my channel. My name is Erica, and today's video is going to be the first episode of a true crime series I'll be doing here on my channel. And these videos will be coming up the first Sunday of every month. Now, I have always been very intrigued by true crime as long as I can remember. And I do have a degree in psychology that I got years ago. And part of getting my degree was studying abnormal psychology, studying the criminal mind. And I just became fascinated with why criminals do some of the things that they do. And what I've determined after reading tons of books and watching tons of documentaries is that there's not always a real clear reason why these things happen. Now, I am from Oregon, basically born and raised here, so I thought it would be really interesting to talk about true crime cases from my state. Now, this first case is about Diane Downs. And I want to give a very huge disclaimer here that this contains very sensitive, very difficult subject matter. This is about the shooting death of a small child and the shooting of her two siblings at the hand of their mother. Now, this happened about 25 minutes away from where I live in 1983. I was in the 3rd grade. And this crime absolutely shook my entire community. Nothing like this had ever happened here, not even close. And I can remember being 8 years old and hearing about this case on the news, in the newspaper. I mean, it was on TV all the time. My parents were talking about it, my neighbors, my teachers, I mean, everybody. And it made such a huge impact on my life as a small child. And I've thought about this case a lot off and on throughout my life. And I just felt like I really wanted to start off this series with this particular case, even though it's very, very hard to talk about, and I'm sure it will be very hard to listen to. And I do recommend that you not have young viewers around while you're watching this. Now, all the information that I'm going to be giving you in today's video came from a book. This one right here. This is called Small Sacrifices by Ann Rule. Now, Ann Rule writes a ton of true crime books. She's probably, I believe, the best true crime author in the world. And this book was really hard for me to get through. I read it before I had kids, so I hadn't read it in quite a while. But reading this again now as a mother and as a grandmother was very difficult. I had to put it down many times, just kind of walk away. Made me cry many times. This is, like I said, this is very difficult subject matter. And I did kind of debate whether or not to even talk about this case, but because Diane has never admitted to doing what she did, I don't know. I just wanted to bring this case to light and talk about it. Now, I also did watch 2 documentaries about Diane Downs, and I'm going to have those linked in my description box. Very well done. Those documentaries include interviews that she did and some audio of her police interrogations. And I really wanted to try to pull those into this video, but I just don't know how to do that. I'm not technically skilled enough to do that. But I highly recommend, if you want some more in-depth information from Diane herself, I would go check out both of those documentaries. So without any further ado, let's get into the case of Diane Downs. Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson was born August 7th, 1955 in Phoenix, Arizona to Wes and Willadine Fredrickson. And they were a very young couple. Willadine was not quite 20 years old when Diane was born. And in very quick succession, she gave birth to 4 more children. So by the age of 25, she was the mother of 5 kids, Diane being the oldest. Now, they moved around a lot in Arizona. They lived in small towns and on farms. They had horses and dogs. And so at a very early age, Diane became a huge lover of animals. And when Diane was 5 years old, her father took a position with the U.S. Postal Service in Phoenix, Arizona, quickly moving up the ladder until in the early 1980s, he was transferred to Springfield, Oregon as a supervising postmaster. Now, Diane was described as a waif, a wistful little girl who was very quiet, very shy, very timid. And she was always seeking her mother's undivided attention. And because her mother was raising 5 kids, Diane didn't always get that. And that was very hard for Diane to understand and to live with. And she just felt like her mother never really fit the expectations that she had of what a mother should be. Now, Wes, her father, was an absolute tyrant. He ruled the house with an iron fist, was very verbally abusive to Diane's mother, Diane and her siblings. He had an opinion about everything. He just kept everybody under his thumb. Now, outwardly, the Fredricksons looked like the perfect ideal American family of the 50s and 60s, but behind closed doors, it was a very ugly family life. Now, as Diane grew into adolescence, she felt very invisible, very overlooked. She was very quiet, very shy, really didn't have any friends. She was still constantly seeking the love and approval from her mother that she never really felt like she got. And so she was just kind of a loner. However, she was very intelligent. She had an IQ of 125, and she scored off the charts for all standardized tests as she was going through school. Now, when she was growing up in the 60s, that was when the Beatles became very popular. And people around her, her peers, Downs were really getting into the different styles and trying to look like the Beatles and doing their hair all cool and wearing fun, funky clothes. And Wes, her father, would never let her do that. She was very homely, very plain, and she absolutely hated that. And Wes's verbal abuse became almost intolerable throughout her adolescence. And as an adult, Diane did accuse Wes of sexually molesting her when she was 12 years old. Now, that's not something that he's ever admitted to, but he's also never denied it. So Diane grew up not really understanding what the word love meant or how love felt, because she really wasn't getting true love and affection and care from either one of her parents. Now, at age 14, Diane's parents sent her away to charm school. And that was the first time in her life that she truly felt beautiful and worthy. She stopped being such a wallflower, and people really started to take notice of her and realize what a beautiful young woman that she really was. Now, this was the time in her life when Diane finally came out of her shell. She stopped being so quiet and so shy. She started talking to everybody. She was described as a torrent of words and would just say anything to anyone all the time. When Diane was 15 years old, she began dating Steve Downs, who was 7 months older than her, and they were both juniors at the Moon Valley High School in Phoenix, Arizona. And she fell madly in love with Steve, and she thought that he'd fallen madly in love with her. And he was very good looking, not pretty boy good looking, but very rugged, handsome, had kind of a swagger when he walked, and she just went gaga over Steve. Now, Steve was the only boy that Diane ever dated throughout her high school career, and he lived right across the street from the Fredrickson house, and so they were together all the time. However, Wes, her father, was not happy about that at all, and he did everything in his power to try to keep them apart, which of course only spurred on their relationship. And within about 6 months of them dating, they did start to have a sexual relationship, and at that point, that was it for Diane. She was just hook, line, and sinker all about Steve. Now, around age 17 was when Diane went through a series of very brutal losses in her life. Her grandparents on her father's side were killed in a drunk driving accident, and she was very close with both of them. She also lost several pets during this time, including her beloved Cocker Spaniel. And then in 1972, shortly after they graduated, Steve joined the Navy and left town, which left her absolutely brokenhearted. She didn't know what she was going to do with herself. So shortly after Steve joined the Navy, Diane did go to Bible college at the Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College in Arizona. Now, she only lasted a couple of semesters there because, in her words, she made the boys there go wild with lust. She had what seemed like several sexual affairs while she was there, and the administration at the Bible college just felt like she was too promiscuous, so she was kicked out and sent home. So by August of 1973, she was living back home with her parents in North Phoenix, which was not ideal, not where she wanted to be. She was absolutely miserable and just pining away for Steve to come home from the Navy. Now, Steve did return to Phoenix from the Navy, I believe in September or October of 1973. And of course, he and Diane picked up right where they left off, which of course Diane's father was not happy about, and he did everything again that he could to try to keep them away from each other. But finally, on November 13th of 1973, Diane and Steve were married by a justice of the peace, and Diane was finally able to get out of the hell that she'd been living in with her father. Unfortunately, married life was not all it was cracked up to be for Diane. Prior to their wedding, Steve was very loving, very affectionate, doted on Diane, but as soon as they got married, that all changed. He just stopped being loving and affectionate towards her, and 2 weeks after their wedding, he took another girl out on a date. His excuse was that he had met her, I believe, when he was in the Navy, and kind of dated her a little bit, and he just didn't want to stand her up. So he did take her out on a date. 2 weeks after they got married. And of course, that did not sit well with Diane at all. She was crushed, she was very hurt. And very early on in their marriage, Steve put hot rod cars ahead of her. He put hanging out with his friends in front of her. So their marriage was tumultuous at best. Now, Diane was still seeking the love and attention that she'd always wanted her entire life. Obviously, she never got it from her mother. Now she wasn't getting it from her husband. So she decided that getting pregnant would be the next best thing, that she would have this child who she could love and that would love her back. Heavy emphasis on the child loving her back. So Christy Lynn Downs, her very first child, was born October 7th, 1974. Christy was a beautiful, happy baby, and Diane was just thrilled to finally have something that she could love and, of course, would love her back. But the really strange thing was that before Christy was even 6 months old, Diane joined the Air Force. She went to Laughlin Air Force Base and lived in the barracks there. And Steve was made to stay home and take care of this baby all by himself. Nobody could understand that. You know, she raved about wanting to be a mother. She wanted to have this child that she could love and that would love her back. And then at such a tender age of not even 6 months, she left to join the Air Force. Just didn't make any sense. Now, she didn't last there very long. She, I think, maybe got completely through boot camp, but I'm not too sure about that. But she ended up getting discharged from the Air Force due to massive blisters on her feet. So she went back to Steve and, of course, resumed her marriage and taking care of the baby. Now, for the majority of the year of 1975, Diane was in transit. She and Steve would have these huge, awful blow-up fights. She'd take the baby, she'd go live with her parents. Her parents, however, did not really want to be in the middle of that, and they really didn't want Diane and the baby there. So they would let her stay for short periods of time and then kind of kick her and the baby out and tell them to go back and live with Steve. So at this point in Diane's life, she felt totally dependent on either her husband or her parents. She didn't really have a job of her own because, of course, she was taking care of the baby. And it was just a really hard time for her to have an identity. She really felt that becoming a mother would give her her identity, but it just never really did that for her. But during this time of constant transit between Steve and her parents, Diane did get pregnant with her second child. And on January 10th, 1976, Cheryl Ann Downs was born. Now, Christy, she was the happy, sweet, fun baby. Cheryl was the exact opposite. She was very sickly. She had colic. She would cry all the time, very needy, just really needed constant attention. And Diane did not really jive with that very well. Very hard for her to mother Cheryl because she was so used to Christy being so docile and so easy, and Cheryl was just not that kind of baby. So a lot of Cheryl's raising was left to Steve and also to Diane's parents. Now, not long after Cheryl was born, Diane talked Steve into getting a vasectomy. They just felt like 2 children was enough. You know, she could barely handle the 2 that she had. So shortly after Steve had turned 21, he had a vasectomy. However, he never went back in 10 weeks to have his sperm tested. You know, you have to do that when you have a vasectomy. You have to go back in and have the doctor make sure that you're not producing any more sperm. And so Diane got pregnant again. Now, Steve and her parents were adamant that she not keep this baby. I mean, she really wasn't taking very good care of the 2 children that she had. She didn't really enjoy being a mother. So Steve and her parents were able to convince her to have an abortion. And that was one of the worst decisions that Diane says she's ever made in her entire life. She was an absolute wreck. And she went into a 2-year period of just utter depression. She was barely able to take care of herself. She really couldn't take care of the 2 girls. She wasn't showering. She wasn't eating. I mean, it was just awful. And at this point in time is when she started writing in diaries. And primarily she would write to this baby that was aborted that she named Carrie. And she would create this whole fantasy life and this fantasy relationship that she had with this aborted baby. Very sad. Now, by late 1978, even though Diane and Steve had a very tumultuous, very rocky marriage, they were both working at the Palm Harbor Mobile Home Company, and they were actually living in a mobile home, one of the mobile home models that they were selling. At that point, Diane begged Steve to have his vasectomy reversed, and he absolutely refused. He was like, there is no way, I'm not going through this anymore. You know, they just kind of gotten her through her major depression after having her abortion, and he was like, no, I'm not fathering any more children with you because you don't really even want to take care of the 2 that we have. So Diane at that point decided to begin a series of affairs with men that worked at the mobile home company, one of which was 19-year-old Russ Phillips, and she got pregnant with Russ's child. Now, Russ was 19, did not want to be a father, so he and Steve sat down with Diane and begged her to have another abortion. And of course, there was no way in the world she was going to let that happen. Now, she didn't really want to be with Russ, so she was really hoping that Steve would raise this child with her. And he was pretty clear from the get-go that under no circumstances would he do that, unless it was a girl. But if it was a son, there was no way he was going to raise another man's son. On December 29th, 1979, Stephen Daniel Downs, known as Danny, was born. And Steve took one look at that baby and fell madly in love with him. So he raised Danny from birth onward, very close with Danny. And Danny was kind of a sickly child at first, but then grew into a robust, chubby, adorable toddler. Now, to the outside world, Diane did her best to try to make it look like she was this wonderful, incredible mother. But most people could see through that. And behind closed doors, Diane was very similar to how her father was, very abusive. She would ignore her children. They were left alone a lot. She was very neglectful. Neighbors would end up taking care of the kids when she and Steve would be at work because she would just leave them home alone. And Steve assumed that she had babysitters, but she never did, or that the kids were with her parents, but that usually wasn't the case. Diane was very verbally abusive. She would scream and yell at her children. She really wanted them to become very independent very early on, and I mean like very early on when they were like toddlers. And of course, Steve and Diane's fights were just awful. They started to become pretty violent. And there was one fight in particular that got pretty ugly, pretty violent. I think this was in like 1980, I believe, where she went into their bedroom in the trailer, the mobile home that they were living in, and took Steve's .22 Ruger pistol out of the closet, went into the bathroom, shut and locked the door, and was threatening to kill herself. And when Steve broke the bathroom door down, Diane was pointing the gun right at his face. And fortunately, he was able to kind of talk her down, but she did shoot a hole in the floor with that gun in the bathroom. And I think that was something that was pretty scary to friends and family of the Downses, is that they knew that Steve had guns in the house. He had a rifle, a .22 rifle, he had that .22 pistol, and then they also had a .38 handgun as well. So, you know, their family and friends were just kind of always thinking, man, something could get really ugly over there. And they were just hopeful or hoping that that just would never happen. Now, in 1980, Diane was not ready to stop having children, but at that point, Steve had finally had a successful vasectomy. So on May 23rd, 1980, unbeknownst to anyone, Diane reached out to a surrogacy clinic in Kentucky, filled out their preliminary form, and was accepted into the first round of the surrogacy program. So she flew out to Kentucky, nobody knew where she was, and had a series of psychological tests done before they would approve her to be a surrogate mother. And that is the point in which a lot of the psychological problems that Diane had were found out. She was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. She was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. They felt that she had no ego at all, and that she always looked to other people to try to develop her ego, and that she was just a very, very lost soul. And because of the way she scored on these psychological tests, the doctors or the psychologists at the Kentucky surrogacy clinic said, no way are we going to be accepting her into this program. So Diane flew back to Arizona, and she found a psychologist on her own that said that she had passed all the psychological tests. And because she had those results, she took that back with her to Kentucky, showed it to the psychologists and the doctors, and said, now what? You're going to inseminate me. So they did. And she became a surrogate mother. Now, another one of the main reasons why she became a surrogate mother wasn't just because she wanted to have a child, but because they were going to pay her $10,000 to deliver this baby and give this baby to this couple that was wanting a child that obviously couldn't have a child on their own. And so she really wanted this money to get the hell away from Steve, take the kids and leave and be done with him once and for all. So after all was said and done, on May 7th, 1982, Diane gave birth to a beautiful baby girl who she named Jennifer. Now, the medical staff at the hospital, when she gave birth to this baby, they were convinced that she was not going to give the baby up, because she was already talking about how much she loved the baby, and of course she'd name the baby. I mean, it was pretty scary, but she did give the baby to the couple. Diane did violate the terms of the adoption, and she did send the baby some clothes, I believe, maybe a baby blanket, but those were returned to Diane as address unknown. So she returned to Arizona after she gave birth to the baby with $10,000 in hand, and finally made the break from Steve once and for all, and they were divorced. In July of 1982 was when Diane would begin a relationship with a man that would forever change the course of her life and her children's life. Now, during her pregnancy, her surrogate pregnancy, she began working at the post office in Chandler, Arizona, running a mail route, and she met Louis Lewiston, known as Lou, and they worked together on the same shift. And initially, Lou really liked Diane. He thought she was really pretty, really smart, really funny, but they began a very steamy affair very quickly. And Lou was married to another woman, and Diane's whole goal was to have Lou all to herself. She became absolutely obsessed with this man. She would call him all the time, show up at his house all the time, just stalk him, basically, was always up in his business constantly. And I do believe that after reading the book Small Sacrifices, that Lou really led her on. I mean, he would break up with her, get back together with her. He'd leave his wife and go stay in an apartment. He'd have Diane move in with him. I mean, it was just very, very bizarre. So I don't really feel like he was innocent in all of that. But she really just became obsessed with him. She just could not understand that they were not going to be together for the rest of their life. She was convinced that that was going to happen, and she would stop at nothing to have him all to herself. Now, Lou had had a vasectomy when he was 21 years old. He never wanted to have children. And that was one of the reasons why he just really didn't want to be with Diane, because she had 3 little kids. And he was very honest and open with her about the fact that he did not want to have children. He didn't want to raise anybody else's children. So that was a huge stumbling block in the relationship. relationship. And Diane tried as much as she could to convince Lou that her children would never be an issue in their relationship, that they were very independent. I mean, they were what, like 8-6 or 8-4-2 or 7-4-2 at the time, and they're independent and they're not going to be involved in their relationship. I mean, just bizarre. And of course, Diane is still writing in her diary lengthy stories and poems for Lou, about their affair. She also had this whole fantasy life in her diary about raising Jennifer, who she'd given up for adoption, the surrogate pregnancy. And, you know, just really had a very delusional mental life that she was putting onto paper in her diaries. So this affair continued on, back and forth, back and forth. They'd break up, get back together, break up, get back together. And finally, in February of 1983, Lou left Arizona and went back to Texas. That's where he was from, just to kind of clear his head and figure some things out, try to decide how to end it with Diane permanently. He knew he needed to tell Nora. Nora, however, did know of the affair. I mean, she wasn't stupid. They had gone to like post office gatherings, like a barbecue, and it was very obvious by the way Diane was acting around Lou that they were having an affair. So she already knew what was going on. So while Lou was gone, Diane just fell apart. She couldn't believe that he'd left her. She didn't know whether or not he was going to come back. And she finally decided that she needed to kind of put her foot down here and kind of force Lou's hand in the affair, like kind of make him decide, do you want to be with your wife or do you want to be with me? So her parents had moved to Oregon. Like I said at the very beginning, Wes had been transferred as a supervising postmaster to the post office in Springfield, Oregon. So Diane got a hold of her parents and said, you know, I think it would be good for us to have a change of pace. I think the kids and I are going to come out to Oregon and live with you guys and, you know, obviously find our own place to live. So in April of 1983, Diane packed up her brand new red with silver accents Nissan Pulsar with her own and her children's belongings, and they headed off to Oregon. Now, Lou had returned back to Arizona shortly before Diane left and had given her a gold necklace to take along with her. Now, his story and her story are very different. His story is that he just wanted her to have like a memento of their affair. Her story was that Lou had given her the necklace to prove that she belonged to him and they would always be together. And Diane's whole plan was that they would move to Oregon and that Lou would leave his wife and join her shortly thereafter, but that never happened. So when Diane reached Oregon in April of 1983, she and her 3 children settled in a small duplex on Q Street in Springfield, Oregon. Diane initially started running a mail route in Springfield, but then was transferred to Cottage Grove, Oregon, which is a little suburb town about 20 minutes away from Springfield. And she was very popular, very well liked. Everybody loved her at the post office. But again, she started neglecting the children, leaving them home alone, leaving them with her parents, to the point where neighbors were getting involved. The neighbors were actually having the kids over for dinner or spending the night. I mean, Diane just was never there. She began a series of affairs with men that she worked with at the post office, just kind of same old, started all over again in Oregon. Now, at one point, one of the neighbors did say that Cheryl, the middle child, she was about 7 years old at this point, told the neighbor that she was fearful of her mother, that her mother had actually taken the kids out on a drive kind of out in the country, stopped the car, had gotten out of the car, hid behind a tree, and had jumped out, this was the middle of the night, jumped out and scared the crap out of all 3 children. And the neighbor was obviously very concerned about the story that Cheryl was telling her and just kind of started keeping more of an eye on what was going on next door. Now, in early May, Diane drove all the way back to Arizona to give the gold necklace back to Lou. At that point, she had gotten herself a rose tattoo on her back with Lou's name underneath of it. So that was one of the reasons why she went back to Arizona, was to show him this symbol of love that she'd had put on her back. And he was pretty freaked out by that. His story is that he just took the necklace from her and said, "Goodbye, Diane, I'm done. I don't want to have anything more to do with you." But of course, what she wrote in her diary was that he was just heartbroken to have the necklace back, that he was so touched and so moved by this tattoo that she'd had put on her back, and that yes, he was still planning on moving to Oregon to be with her forever. Now, in early May of 1983, Diane did a very strange thing that really kind of stumped investigators when they were looking into this crime, investigating the crime. She had a gold unicorn made, like specially made, that had all 3 kids' names engraved on it, and it said, "I love you, Mom," and the date, May 13th, 1983. And I'll get into that more here in a little bit. But when they were investigating the crime, that became a huge talisman of what ended up happening on the night of May 19th, 1983. Close to 11 o'clock at night on May 19th, 1983, Diane pulled into the ambulance entrance of the Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon, laying on the horn of her car and screaming, "Someone shot my kids, someone shot my kids." The nursing staff and the doctors raced out of the car, opened the door up, and grabbed two small children out of the back seat that had clearly been shot and raced them into the emergency room. There was a third child laying on the floor of the passenger's driver's side, and initially they didn't even see her. But luckily, one of the nurses caught a glimpse of her out of the side of her eye and went back out and grabbed her as well. And when they first got these kids laid down on the beds in the emergency room, they were just in absolute shock of what was going on. These little babies had been shot. So the oldest, 9-year-old Christy Downs, who was in the back seat, was found to have 2 gunshot wounds in her chest and 1 at the base of her left thumb. Danny, who was also in the back seat, 3 years old, had a bullet wound middle of his back, really close to his spinal column. And Cheryl, who they found on the floor of the car, covered in her mother's postal sweater, had 2 gunshot wounds to her back and was pronounced dead on arrival. So of course, they instantly start working on these 3 children. Now, Christy, the oldest, the 9-year-old, she had coagulated blood in her airway. And they couldn't figure out why she had all these blood clots there, because Diane had given them a little bit of information about what had happened, that they had just been out on Old Mohawk Road, kind of out in the country for a little sightseeing drive, and the kids had fallen asleep. And out of nowhere, this man shows up, gets her out of the car, shoots all 3 kids. And this had just happened, like, I don't know, 10 minutes before, and she had just raced them to the hospital. But in a 10-minute time span, you wouldn't have coagulated, clotted blood in your airway. So they pretty quickly determined that this did not happen 10 minutes before, that it had been at least probably 30 minutes since the shooting had taken place. Diane was, of course, there in the hospital with them, but was very quiet, very stoic, not really showing any emotion. She looked pretty shocked, and the medical staff that was working on her kids just felt like maybe she was just in a lot of shock. But when they went out to talk to her about the fact that Cheryl was pronounced dead upon arrival, that Christy had some major damage done from these 2 gunshot wounds in her chest, that they were pretty sure she had suffered a stroke and that we're going to need to take her to emergency surgery right away, and that Danny's injury to his spine was most likely going to leave him paralyzed from the waist down, her only question was, wait, you mean it missed his heart? So of course the medical staff was pretty stumped and pretty confused and pretty just disgusted in the way Diane was acting. Now, she did call her parents right away. They did come to the hospital, and of course the hospital staff called the police, and the police instantly went out to investigate the crime scene. And of course they began questioning Diane right away. And what she told the police was that she and her 3 children had driven out to Sunderman Road, which is, I don't know, maybe 15 miles away from the city proper of Springfield, to visit her friend Heather, because Heather wanted a horse, and Diane had some information about this horse and wanted to take it out to Heather to talk about it. And it was about 9:40 at night when Diane and the kids got back in the car to leave. So Diane decided to take a little sightseeing tour, kind of back roads in Springfield. And she went down Old Marcola Road, which leads to Old Mohawk Road. And then Old Mohawk Road kind of circles around and it meets back up again with Old Marcola Road. And as they were driving down Old Mohawk Road, Cheryl had fallen asleep on the floor of the car, and the 2 kids in the back were verging on falling asleep. A man, a bushy-haired stranger, the bushy-haired stranger, the BHS as the police called it, jumped out, stopped her car, screamed and yelled that he wanted the car, made her get out. So Diane gets out, she's standing with the car door open, and all of a sudden, this man leans over her, reaches into the car, and shoots all 3 of her children, and shoots Diane in the arm. Now, Diane, when she arrived at the hospital, she did have a beach towel wrapped around her arm. Now, none of the other kids, their wounds hadn't been attended to at all, but she had the time to stop and put a beach towel around her arm, which they also thought was very interesting. So of course, when the police go out to Old Mohawk Road, they're looking for this bushy-haired stranger. She also said that he was in a yellow, beat-up old car. So of course they're looking for evidence of that. They do find shell casings and spent bullets on the ground on Old Mohawk Road. So they did gather that evidence as well. But there wasn't really any sign of another vehicle They could only find Diane's car tracks at this point. So they were just kind of stumped as to who this person could possibly be. Of course, Diane said she had absolutely no idea who this person was, but that she was absolutely terrified that he knew that they'd lived through the shooting and that he would show up back down at the hospital to try to finish him off. Now, obviously, horribly tragic that this beautiful little girl, 7-year-old beautiful little girl, has passed away. And now this 9-year-old and this 3-year-old, their lives are hanging in the balance. So they had emergency surgery, both of them, and they were able to, patch them up pretty well. Christy did have a pretty significant limp and some physical disabilities for quite a while after the shooting. And she'd also lost the ability to speak. I mean, she could kind of mumble, but she really couldn't speak very well. And Danny was now paralyzed from the waist down. So after all this, the surgeries and everything, they were put into the hospital, of course, under armed guard. And the police were there constantly, just kind of monitoring them, looking over them. Diane would go and visit the children every so often. She did have the bullet removed from her arm. She did have a couple other surgeries, and of course made that into this big, huge, awful part of this whole shooting, not really focusing on the fact that she'd lost her child and her other 2 children had been, horribly wounded. But every interview she gave and on the news and stuff, it was all about her poor arm, that she couldn't tie her shoes for 2 months. Now, the medical staff noticed that when Diane would go in and visit Christy and Danny, that Christy's heart rate would just skyrocket. She would sweat profusely and just had kind of a deer in headlights look on her face, like she was scared to death of her mother. So the police, taking notice of this and talking to the medical staff, decided that they just did not really want Diane there. They were really starting to suspect her. So they issued a restraining order so that Diane could no longer be in contact with her children until the investigation was finished. Now, the police did go to Diane's duplex, and they noticed that even though they'd been living in Oregon for several weeks, that all of their stuff was pretty much still in boxes. There was only 2 pictures in the entire house on top of the TV set. Both of those were of Diane. And there was another 3rd little picture of Lou that was kind of in the picture frame of one of the pictures of Diane. And also they noticed the gold unicorn that was dated May 13th, 1983, with all 3 kids' names on it, engraved with "I love you, Mom" on the bottom. They just thought it was really strange. Why was she memorializing this day, May 13th? It wasn't anybody's birthday. It wasn't Mother's Day. It wasn't anything special. So the police started to think, maybe she did do this. And maybe initially her plan was to do this on May 13th, but they weren't sure yet. So of course they started looking through the house, and they did find a .22 rifle, and they found a .38 revolver, and they found 22 bullets and 22 shell casings. Now, the gun that was used to shoot her children was a .22 Ruger pistol, similar to the one that Stephen Downs had owned, and also that he had reported stolen. Shortly after Diane had moved to Oregon, he noticed that his gun was gone, so he did report that stolen. And the police knew all about this at this point, because of course they got in touch with Steve, they were in touch with Diane's parents, they were getting kind of a full picture of who Diane Downs was. And they were pretty disturbed by the things that they were finding out. So of course they bagged up those bullets, took them to the police station to possibly be used as evidence. Eventually, a ballistics expert got a hold of those bullets and determined that those bullets had been loaded into the rifle, but they'd also been loaded into a .22 Ruger pistol. And they found the same exact markings or etchings on those bullets as they did with the bullets that were found at the crime scene. However, they could never find the .22 Ruger pistol. That has never been found to this day. So they did have a little bit of evidence against Diane, but they just could not prove that she ever had the .22 pistol at this point. Now, another key piece of evidence against Diane came, a few weeks into the investigation. There was a man that was driving down Old Marcola Road on the night of May 19th, 1983, and came upon Diane Downs' car, the red Nissan Pulsar with the silver accents. This car was driving less than 5 miles an hour. This man said that when he looked down at his speedometer, it was barely over 0. So the woman who said that she raced her children to the hospital, drove as fast as she could to get her kids to the emergency room, that was all a lie. She was crawling down Old Marcola Road. Because in actuality, Old Marcola Road is about 12 miles away from the hospital. So if she'd raced as fast as she could to get her children there, she would have been there within, probably 10 minutes. And if she left Heather's house at 9:40, she was probably on Old Marcola Road at about, maybe 10 o'clock onto Old Mohawk Road where the crime took place. And it took her almost 40 minutes to get these kids and herself to the hospital. So that was a huge damning piece of evidence against Diane Downs, because this man knew damn good and well that he'd been following her going, barely 2 miles an hour. And it was her car. He couldn't hear any screams. Nothing. Everything was quiet, but she was just going very slowly down the road. So when Christy and Danny were well enough to leave the hospital, they were both put into foster care. And therapists began working with Christy to help her talk again and help her try to relive the events of the night of May 19th, 1983. Now, the police officers also found a tape in the tape deck of Diane's car. It was by Duran Duran. And she loved the song Hungry Like a Wolf. And that was her song to Lou. And on the night that they'd driven out to Old Millhawk Road, she was listening to that tape and especially that song. So the therapist started playing the song Hungry Like a Wolf around Christy just to kind of see what her reaction would be. And she definitely had some pretty strong reactions, strong emotional reactions to the song. And over time, over the course of several weeks, the therapist slowly began to get her to talk again. Now remember, she's 9 years old, so that's a lot for a 9-year-old child to remember, especially when her parent is the one that inflicted all this damage in her life, shot her brother, and killed her sister. I mean, they knew their sister had died. There was a restraining order against Diane, so she could not have any contact with the kids. Now, Stephen Downs had come from Arizona to Oregon to see his kids, talk with the police, that sort of thing. I mean, obviously he was kind of a crucial part of the investigation, at least talking about Diane's life prior to coming to Oregon. And Steve and Diane had a little chat one day, and Steve did not realize that there was a restraining order against Diane so that she couldn't see the kids. And he told Diane exactly where the kids were because he'd visited them at the foster home. So Diane shows up one day out of nowhere and sneaks Christy out of the foster home and takes her for hours. I mean, they were just frantic. They had no idea where she was. They pretty quickly, I think, determined that she was with Diane, but they just couldn't find her. So Diane eventually brings Christy back to the house, to the foster home. And she was reprimanded for that, but nothing really happened to her, Diane. And Christy just got set back weeks with her progress of speaking. I mean, she just kind of folded in on herself, and it was obvious she was extremely frightened. So who knows what Diane said to her during those hours where she took Christy out of the foster home, but obviously not good. So the therapist, of course, began to work with her again, playing the Duran Duran song and just really talking to her, not giving her a lot of leading questions, but just trying to get her to open up about what happened on the night of May 19th. And slowly, Christy started to talk about what had happened. Now, the therapist came up with an ingenious idea. She said, Christy, I want you to write down the name of the person that shot you and Danny and Cheryl, fold the piece of paper up and put it in an envelope. And what we'll do is we will throw that envelope in the fire. We'll just keep doing that. Every time we meet, I want you to write down the person's name that did this to you, fold it up, put it in an envelope, put it in the fireplace. And eventually, when you feel like you can trust me enough or you feel comfortable enough, I want you to hand me that envelope and allow me to read the name that you've written on the piece of paper that's inside. So that went on for quite a while. Christy would get through her therapy session, and then she would write down the name of whoever shot her, put on a piece of paper in an envelope, and throw it in the fireplace. And finally, she developed enough trust with the therapist that she was able to hand her the envelope with the name of the person that had done this to her inside. And the therapist opened it up and read "Mom" on the piece of paper. Now, this crime took place in Lane County, and Fred Hughey was the assistant district attorney for Lane County, and he was given this case. Now, he had done a lot of misdemeanors, some, kind of decent crime cases, but nothing to this extent. Nothing. And at this point, when Fred took over this case or was given this case, Diane had created this huge media frenzy. She'd reached out to several different news reporters with newspapers and news anchors with news channels in the Lane County area, and was telling them everything that they would want to know about the bushy-haired stranger, about the fact that the police didn't believe her, her children were taken out of her care, put in foster care, there was a restraining order, I mean, all this stuff. But these interviews ultimately did her in. She was very arrogant during these interviews, very rude, just an absolute ass as far as I'm concerned, just awful, just awful. And so the tide started to change. The public really started to see her for who she really was. They were hearing stories that other people were talking about in the media as well, Steve and the neighbors and her family members. I mean, nobody really believed in her. She did have a younger brother, Diane's younger brother, Paul, that believed in her innocence, but nobody else believed that she was innocent. Nobody. anybody. So ultimately, all these interviews that she was doing were really just not helping her because they were making her look like such a horrible monster. I mean, she would shed no tears, talk about very inappropriate things. She would giggle and laugh, act like she was like best friends with the reporter. I mean, just very, very bizarre. And also the story that Diane was telling was all over the place. First, she said she didn't know the bushy-haired stranger. Then she said she did know the bushy-haired stranger, and there was actually two men, and she knew both of them, and she could name both of them, but she refused to do that because she wasn't going to give the police what they wanted. Nothing she said was the truth, nothing. And because her stories kept changing so much, I mean, she just made herself look like even more of a fool. I mean, everybody knew what a liar she was. So in February of 1984, the police finally went and arrested Elizabeth Diane Downs for the murder of Cheryl Downs and the shooting of Christy and Danny Downs. Now, Diane's trial began in early May of 1984, and the courthouse was very shocked when a very pregnant Diane walked into the courthouse. She had met a man during her postal route in Cottage Grove, Oregon, and began an affair, and obviously became pregnant. And of course, it was an absolute media circus. The media was out in the parking lot, in the courthouse, interviewing everybody and anybody that had anything to do with this case. Police officers, medical staff from McKinsey-Willamette, Diane's family, Steve, Lou, everyone. And so they were kind of nervous about how this was going to go down because they didn't want it to be this big media circus, bizarre, over dramatized mess. They just wanted to convict this woman of killing her child and shooting her other two children. And Fred Hughey did an amazing job during that trial. He did such a good job of questioning his witnesses, and he was also a very intricate part of Christy and Danny Downs' life after this horrible crime took place. He spent a lot of time with them in the hospital when they were recovering, and was also a very intricate part of Christy Downs' therapy as well. And he did an amazing job of trying this case. I mean, just unbelievable. Did a really good job with the ballistic expert, the bullet expert, to really help explain what the markings on the bullets meant. That yes, they had been in Diane's rifle, but also in a .22 caliber handgun that she owned. He also had an amazing blood spatter pattern expert testify in court against Diane, because Diane's story was that the bushy-haired stranger had reached through the car and shot Christy and Danny in the back seat, and then had turned the gun on Cheryl and shot her on the floor of the driver's side passenger seat, and that he'd shot Diane in the arm. However, the blood spatter pattern said a completely different story. It showed that someone had gotten shot outside of the car and then most likely was put back into the car. He also brought the gentleman who had driven behind her down Old Marcola Road when she was going barely 5 miles an hour, speeding, she said, to get her children to the hospital. There was no way that that really happened. The state's biggest witness, however, was 9-year-old Christy Lynn Downs. They had worked with her for a really long time to be able to sit in the witness stand and testify against her mother. And Fred Hughey was so loving and so kind and so wonderful with her when she was on the stand, and really helped talk her through what had happened that night. And Jim Jagger, who was Diane's defense attorney, tried everything he could to confuse poor Christy Downs, this 9-year-old child who had been shot by her mother. Brother's been shot by her mother. You know, they're physically permanently disabled now. Her sister is dead. And this man gets up and tries to do, like I said, everything he can to confuse her. And she did such an amazing job. If she didn't understand something, or he tried to lead her down a path that she just wasn't grasping, she just wouldn't answer. Now, Christy did say during her testimony that while her mother was shooting herself and her brother in the back seat, that Cheryl woke up and tried to flee from the car. Diane did shoot her outside of the car and then put her back in the car. So everything just kind of tied together to finally show and prove that Diane was the murderer here and that she had shot all 3 of her children. Now, another key piece of testimony that Christy Downs gave during the trial was that she vividly remembered seeing the .22 Ruger pistol in the trunk of her mother's car on the night of May 19th, 1983, when they headed out to Heather's house to give her the information about the horse. And she also stated that that pistol had been in the trunk of Diane's car since they left Arizona to move to Oregon. So that was a huge piece of evidence that Fred Hughey really wanted her to be able to talk about during the trial. And ultimately, she was able to say on the witness stand that yes, her mother had shot herself, her sister, and her brother. They also played the song Hungry Like a Wolf in the courtroom. And just to kind of lay the scene for the jury members. And Diane sat there and tapped her foot and snapped her fingers and just kind of rocked out Well, they played a song that was playing on her tape deck while her children were being shot. So after weeks of very intense testimony during this trial, and after 36 hours of jury deliberation, the jury finally came to a decision on June 17th, 1984. Diane Downs was found guilty of 2 counts of attempted murder, 2 counts of first-degree assault, and 1 count of first-degree murder. And on August 28th of 1984, she was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years and was taken directly to the Women's Correctional Institute in Salem, Oregon, I believe. Shortly thereafter, she did give birth to a beautiful baby girl, and that baby was put up for adoption. But the story does not end here. Oh, no, it doesn't. On July 11th, 1987, Diane Downs escaped from prison. She scaled the wall, put her jacket over the top of the barbed wire, hopped down, and walked through a neighborhood to a house of another woman who was incarcerated along with her. Her husband, this woman's husband, was still living in the house, and kept Diane there for 10 days. Now, when the police finally found evidence of where she was, they'd done a search of her cell, and they found a clipboard with a pad of paper on it, and they could see some markings on this piece of paper, so they did like a rubbing of it, and it was a map. This woman who she was sharing a cell with had drawn a map to her house that Diane had followed to get to where she was after she escaped from prison. And when the police finally knocked on this door, and this man, this woman's husband, answered the door, he did turn Diane over to the police, but he told them that she had seduced him and that he'd fallen madly in love with her. I don't know what it is about this woman, but she's able to make men fall in love with her just all over the place. So they did rearrest her, cuff her, and they ended up transferring her from the prison in Salem, Oregon to a maximum security women's prison in New Jersey. Now, currently, she is in the Chowchilla Women's Prison, and I believe that's in Stockton, California. And she has been up for parole, I think twice, maybe more than that, but I think twice. And fortunately, they have not allowed her to be granted parole. And I really hope that they never grant her parole. I just don't think she should ever again be walking the streets. Now, shortly after the trial and the sentencing, Christy and Diane Downs went to live with Fred Hughey, the state's attorney, the assistant district attorney of Lane County. He and his wife, Joanne, adopted both Christy and Diane Downs, and they lived with them all through childhood into their adulthood. And I am just so happy that that's how it ended up for them. Fred really genuinely cared about those children. He and his wife both genuinely cared and loved those children so much. And so wonderful that they were able to go to a loving, nurturing, wonderful environment after all the awful trauma that both of those kids had had to endure. Now, I want to end this video by giving you guys my 2 cents about Diane Downs. And here's the thing. I understand she had a horrible childhood. You know, she was ignored by her mother. She was abused by her father. And I don't make light of that. I mean, that's very serious. And I understand that it really devastated her as a child. And I also understand that she never really felt like she got the love that she craved and wanted throughout her entire life. You know, she tried to find that with Steve. That didn't happen. She thought that having children would bring that love into her life. And because she kind of had it backwards here, you know, the parent has to give the child love first. And the love that you get back from your child doesn't happen right away. I mean, it takes a while. They're babies. They don't understand that relationship at first. And then because she got so obsessed with Lou, the man that she was having the affair with, even though he wasn't obsessed with her, I mean, he cared about her, I guess, but not anywhere near the way Diane felt about him. I mean, he was her entire world. And he was very clear with her about the fact that he did not want to have children. And that created this whole crime. I mean, the reason why she drove her kids out in the middle of nowhere to try to murder all 3 of them was because in her mind, she thought that if she got rid of her children, Lou would be with her forever. And he had never planned on doing that. And I know all those things, and I read the book, and I watched the documentaries, but I don't care. None of this makes any sense to me. A mother should love her child more than anything or anyone on the planet. A mother should keep her children safe and protect them. And Diane did the exact opposite of that. She was this monster in their life. Not just at the crime scene, which of course that was the worst of it, you know, obviously, but she just never really treated them with the love and attention that they really deserved. And I guess maybe because it was never modeled for her by her parents, I don't know. I mean, I can understand that. My rational mind can understand that, but my emotions, my emotional being just will never be able to wrap my head around what she did to her children. And my heart breaks for the loss of Cheryl Downs. And my heart breaks for the trauma that Christy and Diane Downs suffered at the hands of their mother. You know, these gunshot wounds affected them for the rest of their lives. Christy suffered a stroke, had to learn how to walk and talk again. Danny, at the age of 3, was paralyzed from the waist down and has spent his entire life in a wheelchair. I mean, I don't know how you ever rationalize that. I mean, there's no way you can. There's no way you can ever rationalize what happened to these children. And one of the things that really gets under my skin about this whole thing is the fact that Diane Downs has never admitted to what she did. Never. Not that that's going to change anything, but it just drives me crazy that she can't admit that she's the one that did this to her children. There was no bushy-haired stranger or 2 bushy-haired strangers or whatever other story she came up with. She alone tried to murder 2 of her children and successfully murdered the other one. I'm really happy that Danny and Christy were adopted by Fred Hughey and his wife. I really hope that they were able to recover well from their injuries and to sustain good mental health. I mean, I can imagine that mentally this whole situation was so traumatizing. And I really just wish them both the very best and all the happiness and love that life has to offer. My next true crime video will be coming the first Sunday in March, so please keep your eye out for that. I really thank you guys for taking time out of your life to sit down and watch this video. I understand this was very difficult to listen to. It was pretty difficult to give you guys the facts of this case. I know there was a lot. This is going to be a long video, but I just wanted you guys to have as much information about this case as I could provide. I do really recommend, though, that you go to those 2 documentaries I'm going to have listed in my or linked in my description box and watch those. Those are really well done and provide more information than I was able to give here. And I really look forward to seeing you guys again in my next video. But please, in the meantime, take very good care of yourself. Be well, safe, and happy.